Morning. Yeah,
Welcome everyone. Before I start today, I just want to say another very big thank you to all of today's panelists, moderators, and of course our behind the scenes tech teams for making this all run so smoothly. If you can believe it, this is our last panel discussion of the conference. Of course, we do have some social mix and sips planned for after this session to wrap up the 3 days, but it really has been an inspiring space of reconnecting to people and new learning opportunities as well. So it's my great pleasure today to welcome you to session 6C, entitled Green Turtle Key, an Island 2 years post-Dorian. Welcome back, of course, if you are joining us as a repeated conference user, or if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. This is going to be a very informative and timely session for all of us living in the Caribbean. The session will be moderated by Jody Minnis, Gallery Manager at Turn Gallery, with panelists Leanne Russell, an artist and cultural worker based in Abaco, and Anthony and Felicia Blanco, proprietors of the new Plymouth Inn in the Bahamas. We will be looking at a pre-recorded hour-long session with our panelists and moderator before moving into a Q&A at the end. So please remember to put your questions, you'll be waiting for those answers in the Q&A session, and we will also make sure the chat session is being checked as well. So if I can invite the tech team to begin our presentation.
Welcome to our session, Green Turtle Key, an Island 2 years post-Dorian. I will be your moderator for today. My name is Jody Minnis. I'm the Gallery Manager of Turn Gallery. And to open the panel, I will be reading a poem by Bahamian writer Yasmin Clinton from her collection of works, An Olive Branch, which was compiled post-Dorian. The poem is called To Unhome Yourself, and it's the first poem in the series. Live in the path of a hurricane. Do not plead with it. To divert its course, instead collect 5 bottles of liquor, a deck of 52, 2 portable chargers, 7 pieces of plywood, 8 Where Are You Texas, 3 deep breaths, 4 unshed tears, and a gargled prayer. To begin the panel, I would first like to start with sort of situating ourselves within the archipelago of the Bahamas. Most often when people talk about the Bahamas, we speak specifically of New Providence and Nassau, which is the capital city. However, during Hurricane Dorian, 2 of our northern islands, Grand Bahama and Abaco, were devastated. And specifically within this context, we will be talking about Green Turtle Key, which is a small key off of the coast of Abaco, where our panelists, Leanne Russell and Felicia and Andrew Blanco, are now situated. We'll begin now with Leanne Russell, talking about her practice as an artist and documenting the architecture in Green Turtle Key, Abaco.
Hi, thank you, Jody. So I am from Green Turtle Key. I am currently living at home and creating art, and also documenting the history currently as it's unfolding, and also previously. Right now, the work that I have been creating post-Dorian is a documentation of not only the devastation of that hurricane in 2019, but also the intersectionality of the Great Abaco hurricane of 1932, which not only mimicked the path of Dorian, but also mimicked the destruction that we saw in 2019 with Dorian. So my image is actually the image of the conference this year, and Home Gone is a part of that series. The work that I have been creating is an interlay of images taken after Dorian and traditional salt box architecture found on the Keys and the Abacos, and archival photos from the Malone archive and my great-grandfather Walter Kendrick's archive after 1932. This is an example of traditional architecture. This home also unfortunately was lost to Dorian, but also makes an appearance in a lot of my work. So a lot of the focus, unknowingly, a lot of the focus in taking the archives has now evolved into documenting these homes that actually appear in my work before they were demolished. A lot of them stood after Dorian, but were not structurally sound. And unfortunately, we have lost 7 traditional homes to demolition. This shows the same house on Key West Street, and as it appears after Dorian, almost as open dollhouse. You can see all of the rooms. And unfortunately, like I was saying, what I really wanted to appear as artwork has turned into a practice of actually saving artifacts and not just featuring the houses in my work. So it has evolved. Key West Street now, this is a 1957 archival photo, and this is the same house featured in the collage, but the interior architectural earmarks of the houses. So we've actually started going into these houses, like I said, pre-demo, and not only using them in the work, but also documenting certain architectural features that are only found here. The previous slide shows the beams that are labeled. One of the features of houses here and traditional architecture, some of them have been taken apart and moved multiple times, not only just on the island, but from island to island, from our island to Key West. This is something that is a mark of sustainability and resiliency in our architecture, and something that is only found here because of the prominence of hurricanes, because people, this kind of trauma is cyclical. A lot of the homes here you will find have been taken apart and moved post-hurricanes in the past. This is another example of that with the dowel work, easy to take apart, easy to maneuver and then reassemble according to the Roman numerals there. Once they correlate, you know that you're putting your house back together in a different site, somewhere where unfortunately you can restart your life, or somewhere that is safe outside of the path of another hurricane. This is now segueing into the work that I have done with Andrew and Felicia. This is actually a part of my newest series, and this is including photos from the historic property that they are now restoring, the new Plymouth Inn. And this is a natural evolution of the work. The 1932 or 2019 series, which was shown in the previous slides. And this is now transitioning into what Green Turtle Key is currently like. So my work now has gone from documenting the immediate aftermath of Dorian to now documenting what Green Turtle Key is like, not only referencing what New Plymouth as a town looks like after 2 years of reconstruction and rebuild, but also the hope of what we would like by referencing, previous glory. This shows a 1961 archival photo of the same location and what it looks like today. So a merger of past and present, but also in that space, hoping for, restoration of the former glory and evolution into new things. This is one of our cultural heritage sites that actually survived the storm. And this is a sculpture garden adjacent to New Plymouth Inn. You can see it in the background. This is some of the work that we plan to take up going forward as cultural workers and, help to restore monuments like this. So the sculpture garden actually pays tribute to 19 prominent members of Green Cherokee Society, whether it's school teachers. We have members that have gone on to be the first billionaire in Key West. Key West and New Plymouth are sister cities, so we're very, very closely tied. You can see now the midwife in the background of this photo. So sites like this, the town of New Plymouth is fairly tight knit as far as the way that it's laid out. You can literally walk from one end of the town to the next in 15 minutes. And so it is accumulated, every street has some kind of historic landmark, some kind of historic building that is worth paying note of. And this is why we're so passionate about what we are doing and trying to not only document those and earmark those in digital heritage sites online, but also make sure that we are retaining this kind of history going forward, even if we do lose it to possible demolition if it can't be saved.
Thank you for that, Leanne. I just want to take a moment to unpack some of the things that you referenced in your presentation just now, because I know, and some of our listeners may not know, that your practice wasn't necessarily a practice of documentation prior to Dorian. You, at least my knowledge of your practice is being more of a multimedia artist. You painted, you did assemblages in a way that wasn't specifically linked to preserving the heritage of the island, but it responded to you living in Green Cherokee. So can you talk a little bit about just the what that sense of imperativeness was to document after Dorian?
Yes, of course. So yes, this is nowhere near what I was doing pre-Dorian. So I've been a practicing artist in the Bahamas for, I guess, 10 years now. I've worked with Jody and shown beside her, and also have had my work curated by her for many years. And previous to this, my work always spoke to what it is to be from Abaco and kind of decentralizing the narrative outside of the capital of Nassau and taking it into the Family Islands, my perspective and what it is to be Bahamian outside of Nassau, trying to make artwork that spoke to that and to give us visibility. And I was not a photographer, I was a painter. I was working in found objects, reclaiming those. I upcycled art. And after Dorian, I lost everything. The house that I was in was gone. and you want to create artwork, you want to document it. As an artist, you kind of have to create during those times. And the only thing I had was a camera. So I began just taking photos just out of necessity. Just, you have to feel like you're creating, you have to feel like you're documenting something to get through that kind of trauma. And about a month after Dorian, I received an email from Marisa Malone, and Marisa is the daughter of Brent Malone, a very prominent Bahamian artist, one of what we refer to as the fathers of Bahamian art. And his father was actually on the ground with the British military in relief efforts after the 1932 hurricane, and had also done the same thing, was a relief worker that was sent to document everything as a writer as well for one of the newspapers. And he took photos of everything. And in looking at this archive, the only reason I recognize a lot of these places is because the destruction was so similar across the board. And some of the archival photos earlier, Jody, if you wanted to go back to the black and white photos. So this was one of the photos in his archive. And this house actually stood for many, many years, or this roof actually stood in that same place for many, many years. And when I put it out, the response that I received from the community, oh, this is Little Maggie Bar. And this roof stood in the Green Turtle Key community. And they made a makeshift bar out of this. And Miss Olive Boodle is in this photo, and she was the proprietor of this bar. Also lost everything, but out of necessity made a bar. And this is the reason that this piece is called Little Maggie Bar. And this is actually a three-way photo collage, because the girls in the photo are actually the Bodie sisters, which are her granddaughters. And that photo is an archival photo of the 50s. So it became a merger of the photos that I took, as well as archives that began to trickle in when people found out what I was doing. So it started out with the Malone archive, and interfacing that with photos that I took in the same spot, in the same position, showing similar destruction, just speaking on how trauma here is cyclical and how we have been through this before. And what did we lose previously in 1932? What remained? What have we lost in Dorian? How do we begin to rebuild? And also this title of resiliency that is sometimes forced on us, having to rebuild in quote unquote unshaky foundations. And as Amanda Coulson puts it, how do we build on an unstable foundation and expect stable results? And that is both figuratively and literally, because that is what we do in the islands. We have a relatively small window, turnaround to rebuild and regain some semblance of normalcy. But what are we losing in doing that?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that is a perfect segue into Felicia and Andrew's work, and I will take our slides back there. Because, it's so interesting to see the coverage over the last 2 years about the Bahamas, and having Abaco and Grand Bahamas spotlighted and highlighted because of Dorian, and these stories that are still like unfolding. But I think what is so interesting about it as well is that often we weren't able to tell our own stories. Our stories were, people came down, like Malone's father, even though he had Bahamian heritage, is that people come down, they survey the land, and then they tell our stories. But Dorian has allowed us to tell our stories in a way that we haven't prior.
Exactly. Yep.
And not in a way that's directly tied to the tourism industry in a very specific way. And I think it's really interesting, especially getting to know about what Felicia and Andrew did, that they're restoring an inn that has been around for decades. But I think the way in which we have to tackle or confront our negotiation with tourism is probably through this lens of seeing these historic sites, building it not necessarily just for consumption from other, but how these places can restore us and heal us while we tend to them. So Felicia and Andrew, I would like to now invite you both to talk about the new Plymouth Inn.
Thank you for that segue, Jody and Leanne. I'm Felicia, and this is my husband, Andrew. We are restoring the new Plymouth Inn, but a bit about ourselves before that. I grew up here on Green Turtle, and my family goes back many, many generations. Leanne's actually my cousin. So I grew up here and went away to Florida for school for a while and became a teacher there, where I met my husband. And I spent about 10 years there, completing college, teaching, and then eventually meeting Andrew.
Hello, I have lived in the state of Florida my entire life. I'm a builder. I have worked alongside my father for over 8 years, specialized in construction, specifically renovations. New Plymouth, the Bahamas was definitely something new to me. I had never traveled outside of Florida in regards to anywhere else in the Bahamas, but it is a place that I fell in love with almost immediately because of its culture and past and people.
So after Hurricane Dorian, we both came here about within the week. Andrew was here before I was actually, and then I came back as all my family was here. So we were here on the ground right after the storm. We did not ride out Dorian here, but we came right after to help with relief efforts and to help our family and friends, but also the community. So we went through those initial survival stages with everyone, although we didn't go through it. We went through that, which later transitioned into the documentation with Leanne, and also just really the walkthroughs of all the houses. We went through New Plymouth and just went through all the homes, and it led us to the New Plymouth Inn. Leanne, Andrew, and myself went through, and we were documenting. That's all we were there for. But we
were initially was to help any families that had open roofs, dry-in houses, anything that was structurally falling apart that could be embraced or fortified so that there's no immediate danger. We did that for several weeks actually. And once everyone was, dried and situated in a safe place, our immediate attention was then these old buildings that had been forgotten. A lot of those historical homes and even, the museum, countless properties that had no one inhabiting it and had been almost lost in time were wide open, exposed to all the elements, decrepit, literally falling apart. We would go around and see which ones needed, tarps, which ones needed 2x4 to hold part of the building up. It was, became a full-time job. There was many mornings where Leanne, Felicia, and myself were up at sunrise to, the last crow in the evening. And that's when Leanne brought out the camera and started taking pictures, started recording it, trying to capture all these things before they were swept away by Dorian.
with the New Plymouth Inn and purchasing it, it's been a huge passion project for really the three of us. Andrew and myself are purchasing it, but Leanne has been such a big part of it, and together the three of us have these huge visions for the inn and what we hope to see it as, more than just a hotel in the middle of the island, but also as a place where we can display history and display culture in a way that takes it outside of the museum, in a way that's evolving with with the world that's evolving. You know, we don't want to see just our history in the four walls of the museum. We want to see it. We want to immerse yourself in it when you come to the end. The photos on the wall, the native plants that you might see on the property, the cuisine that you're gonna enjoy while you're there. We also plan to have a bush medicine garden that will be used in some of our cocktails. So a little spin on the traditional bush medicine, and just, you know, bringing the history to life. So when we started the demo in 2020, we realized the project was a bit bigger than expected, and Andrew can talk a little about the structure of the building and what we saw.
Yes. Although I specialize in renovation, I am not an expert in, say, 200-year-old building and old colonial construction. It is an ongoing learning curve, and I'm fortunate to have certain members of the community and members of certain organizations, such as Todd Dickinson, that have kind of aided and answered many questions that I've had so far. For instance, things such as cut nails being used, old shiplap and beam tie-ins, as you can see here on the Curry House, a number of beams. This is actually an example of carpentry or woodwork that, you know, predates back to building ships, where these dowels were pinned in between two solid beams, in this case rafters, that essentially created one solid rafter, which is, I mean, structurally incredibly strong. And it's definitely an old method that has been brought, you know, since shipbuilding in the early 1700s, that you just clearly don't see anymore. And it's fascinating to see the longevity that these roofs have lasted. You know, in Abaco, every modern house, every house you've seen, every other house is missing roof, partitions, dormers, everything. These have gone through the test of time, and even to date, Dorian. And it's a true testimony to the way things were done in previous times. It really should be an eye-opener to modern building, although the techniques may not, you know, match with modern codes and regulations. There is a sense of the art that was done behind it that made it more than just a building way or structure. In fact, in this picture, it's kind of hard to see, but if you notice where Felicia is hammering, that is a corner bead. Well, it's a corner beam, sorry, on top of a double plate for the roof. That is a single solid piece of wood that literally spans about 3 foot by 3 foot, cut into a perfect 90-degree angle to brace that corner of the house. I have never seen that before. I have tried to research and Google, and I am open to anyone that has any information or can enlighten me on, you know, where this originated from. But I've never seen it. But it is truly a testimony of when these old houses were built, they were built to last, not just last storms, but last the test of time and last anything that can get thrown at them, because it's truly an impressive and fascinating piece of history.
Thankfully, we were able to actually get those beams
Yeah.
out, all 4 of them.
Yeah.
We hammered some out, Leanne and I, and Olive, who's now here, and Andrew. We were able to get a few, and then when they demoed the house, they actually pulled it out with the tractor, the excavator for us. So we have those 4, and we hope to repurpose them or display them in some way in the inn, because again, we hadn't seen that before. So it was just really cool to see, and we're excited that we have those and can bring some light to them for other people that may have not seen them before.
And here was some still shots of the inn. Post-Dorian kind of just frozen in time in itself. It was you could peel back the trim, the crown, the layers of paint behind it. Everything seemed to tell a story. we fell in love with it from the beginning. Just
So these photos are the historic building. So we have another building on the property, but this shows the historic hotel side. And what you can see here is just that it was wrecked in the storm. Unfortunately, it was a bit neglected before the storm as well. So between those two factors, it's taken a total gut job, unfortunately, inside. But thankfully, the bones of the building are pretty secure. Can we talk about that?
yes, the structurally, luckily, the new Plymouth Inn is sound. There are some minor stress cracks in the exterior of the building that need to be attended to, and pillars. I mean, there's no shortage of work by any stretch of the imagination. But it is a testimony again to, like I was saying before, that these houses were built to withstand everything thrown in their way, even without modern hurricane ties and other modern techniques. They have proven themselves time and time again, and it's just brings me back to one of those fascinating things about New Plymouth and preserving some of these things. Here we have a picture of an old, that's a new baseboard. Instead of ripping all the baseboards out, I wanted to stay as true as possible. I had to resource a couple different machines, and I was able to rip and grout my own baseboards that match the existing trim work for the hotel. So that's what I'm doing there, and as well as setting up temporary power.
Yeah, and Jody, if you want to just go back to the last slide for a minute. No, the previous one. Yeah, so a couple things to note, just the next one.
Forward.
With the things that we hope to restore in the inn, there's hardwood floors in the inn that we hope to be able to restore. There's been some water damage. If you want to flip to the demo pictures. Sorry. There's been some water damage, unfortunately, through the roof. It's okay. So we really hope to be able to restore those floors. There's also the cedar shakes were traditionally used in many homes throughout New Plymouth, and we're going to try to bring those back on the roof. So here we talked a little bit about preserving some of the items from the old homes being torn down. The photo on the left, we actually ripped the siding off of this building that was going to be torn down. The building was actually built in Hopetown, and each plank was numbered to be reassembled on Green Turtle. So before they pulled that down, we pulled all the siding off, and we're hoping to repurpose it as our ceiling in the restaurant and bring that back to life. And then in the second photo, it's just kind of a correlation. Those are my grandma and my great grandma painting a dock in my family home that we grew up in, along with me restoring the hardwood floors. So just kind of showing the resiliency with everyone in the community here, not just, men, or it's everyone taking part in restoring what's important. So this is the New Plymouth Inn currently. It is in need of major repair and restoration, which is what we intend to do.
Yes, and one of the biggest obstacles coming forward is the preservation of its historical properties, and while still modernizing it to the modern times, and I should say offering accommodations that are of the 21st century. It's definitely going to be a challenge, and possibly one of the hardest I've had to date, as well as if in the slide, as you can see, these wooden columns actually are single pieces of lumber stretching from the ground up. That is something that you can't go to the hardware and buy. That's something where you need to preserve, and along with a lot of that original Abaco pine that that entire decking is made out of. Every piece that can be saved will be saved and needs to be saved, but as well as fortifying it and bracing everything so that it can be stronger, and better than it was, without losing that colonial touch that it's had for so many years. So
Yeah, and thank you Felicia and Andrew. And I apologize for the slides, but I think that's so, I'm glad that you touched on it. I think that when we think about the history of people who've lived here and the technologies that they invented, because like Leanne said, nothing that we are going through now hasn't happened before. So even when you think about why the Arawaks may have had certain technologies, why the Loyalists had certain technologies, why enslaved people who are on our islands had certain technologies, it was all in response to the landscape. And I think that we in this current moment have to as well be responsive to the landscape, and that response, I think, just following you all's lead is to actually look back, to look at how our structures are made, to actually know the history of the land to help us to move forward. I wanted to talk to you three about, I think when we talk about preservation and conservation, specifically here, I know you guys talked about taking it out of the museum. This is a home remodeling project at its roots. And I think that is there anything specifically that you've learned or that you would want to know about this task, whether it's the history of the beams, whether it's how Abaco pine dries? Because I think something that I saw after going to Eleuthera is that a lot of the houses that, I think it was a 1929 hurricane as well, or it's Hurricane Floyd, because some of their houses had steel in it, the steel rusted in the homes. And then the concrete then decided to split because of the rust, because the houses, even now in 2021, are still moving because of that. So can you talk to a bit about what you would want to learn about the drying processes of the house, the materials? Is there any workshops or anything that you think would be beneficial to you guys? What help, or what expertise would you guys need to help move this forward?
So one thing that we've all discussed is, keeping this in historically correct, but also it will be a functioning hotel in the 21st century. So there's kind of this challenge of the outside can look the same aesthetically. We plan to keep that the same, but when we get into designing the rooms, how are we gonna design those in a way that represent the history of the building or of the island, or just the time that it was built in, without it looking so outdated. So trying to kind of merge the two ideas where you're not going to step into a 200-year-old hotel and see the modern, white walls of a Holiday Inn. We want it to be accurate, but also modern. So it's been a challenge to kind of think of those two things because they're kind of opposite ends of the spectrum. But we know that people out there are doing it. So that's something that we would definitely be interested in some expertise on, or some workshops, or having someone just discuss with us. That's one thing that's challenging myself.
Myself, yes. Like you said, a lot of the previous plumbing was done by cast iron. A lot of the concrete used, I believe, was used with brackish water because of the scarcity of fresh water in the building back then. I have no knowledge of how those properties affect the concrete. That's definitely a big one for me. There's certain woodworking skills that I am unfamiliar with, and even dealing with Abaco pine in general, it is such a resilient wood. It's incredibly hard to work with. If there's any techniques that to make it simpler, or a certain amount of at what period of the maturity of the wood is best to work with it. Yeah, quite a mostly questions.
Quite a bit of things.
Yeah.
And Leanne, I think that there is something very special about laying down one aspect of your practice to pick up something totally and entirely new because you, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but like just to it's a process of reclaiming or feeling like you have agency or feeling like you can do something. Can you talk about that? Because this started in 2019 and it's something that, you know, it's 2 years later, you're still on the forefront of relief efforts. You're still on the forefront of making people aware of what's happening in Green Turtle Key, and not just Green Turtle Key, but in Marsh Harbor as well, in Abaco proper. So can you talk about what it means to respond to a call in a way where the call was imperative in a way?
Yeah.
And what that looks like, or what it means to translate that sense of immediacy to persons who are not facing the same conditions.
Of course. So I think it is important to note that our panel is a little different than the other panels at this conference, because of the fact that we are not trained historians. We do not have a background in conservation, or even though Andrew has a background in construction that is rooted in renovation and conservation of older structures. When you come into Green Turtle Key or the Abacos, the architecture here and the building methods were so specific because of the makeup of our communities and the fact that we have been a community that has had to rely on itself and be resilient within itself. A lot of building techniques you're not going to see anywhere else. Abaco pine you don't find anywhere else. It's a hardwood that builders here only learn how to deal with after years and years and modifying tools specific to here. So in the same vein, we've been thrown into this and taken up the mantle. And the panel now is kind of geared towards reaching out and not only sharing the projects that we have become a part of, but also reaching out to persons who might be more well-versed in working with projects similar to these and asking for help. And that is really why I'm still at it 2 years later, is garnering the support of similar communities in the Caribbean and people who are continuously sharing knowledge and continuing to share what we have learned just by being on the ground and being immersed in this and being immersed in the rebuild. Because we're only going to survive climate crisis and these type of climate disasters by coming together as a Caribbean nation and sharing, how we restore ourselves after these kind of natural disasters. And even though it's very specific ways in which we rebuild and in which we function in each of these communities, the response and the sharing of information is imperative from each of our respective islands, because everything is applicable. It's the way that we are going to fortify our countries to be able to survive in these times.
I agree. Yeah. So thank you for that. And our last question, because I know our time is dwindling down, but I think I wanted to ask about the being on an island that isn't self-sufficient in a way where, other places are. You have to rely on import a lot. And one of the things that you import is visitors and people's, due to our need for tourism and tourism being at the center of our economy. How do you then balance that hospitality with the need to self-preserve and restore?
This is something that we have all had conversations about, because that is something that we came in contact with a lot after Dorian is disaster capitalism, and people who have come in and vulturistically, I guess, come in to capitalize, to buy up properties. And as local Bahamians, I think this is why we're so passionate about it, why Andrew and Felicia are so passionate about purchasing this 196-year-old historically registered property, is so it stays in the hands of Bahamians. And restoring it in a way that isn't going to be about the tourism product. It's not just going to be about foreign consumption. It's going to be a place that you can go and, even as Bahamians, appreciate your culture and your history and what we have managed to retain here in New Plymouth. So that is something I think all of us are passionate about, is that even though we're cognizant that tourism is the Bahamas' #1 industry, and a lot of these spaces are being restored in a way that it is palatable for tourist consumption and in a way the tourism product, there has to be something there that is ours. There has to be something there that is genuinely Bahamian and isn't just, it's the Disney World versus something that is organic, and how do you keep those two things separately? You don't want a tourism landmark. You want something that is going to be interesting to tourists because it is genuinely Bahamian.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think that's the end. I don't want to ask too much questions because I know that we have to leave some time for other people to ask all the good questions. So thank you, Leanne, Felicia, and Andrew, for your presentation, not just your presentation, but your time over the past 2 years, your dedication to the history of Green Turtle Key, and the important work that you all have done. It won't go unnoticed. And I think that, it's a thankless job sometimes, but I am here right now to thank you for that job. So we'll now move on to our live Q&A session.
Thank you. I'm just going to, if I can thank everyone for that recorded session before we move into the Q&A. And again, just say how inspiring. I think everyone in the audience is aware that Leanne's, one of Leanne's amazing images is actually the lead image for the conference. And it was very clear to the conference committee as soon as we saw it that it really spoke to the theme of resilience. So seeing more of those images and then learning about the renovation of the historic inn and seeing resilience in practice, I think has been a really impactful moment. So if I can say thank you for the recorded session, and of course bring back Leanne, Jody, Andrew, and Felicia to talk to us more and to take our questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. So I'm going to start, and thank you all for being here. Today, I'm going to start with a question from from the chat. The question says, how can we encourage fundraising efforts for restoration through art or other initiatives?
Is that specific to the projects here, or are we speaking things that we've done or intend to do?
I think let's speak maybe broadly about it. Just on the whole, like how can art be used as a fundraising vehicle for restoration projects? Because I know that specifically just pull in from my memory, Angelica Wallace Whitfield and her Hope is a Weapon t-shirt. She screen printed shirts and hats and donated part proceeds and sometimes all proceeds to Idea Relief, which was the organization I was directly working with fundraising at post-Dorian. So how, what does that look like and how can you encourage it, like initiatives like that to keep on happening?
Felicia, do you want to take that? I know Felicia is just, we've brainstormed a lot with how to incorporate the inn into these kind of initiatives in downtown New Plymouth. So this is something that we're definitely passionate about. So I'll let her take this one.
Yeah, so Leanne and I, along with Andrew along the way, but mostly Leanne and I on this project. We have been in talks with each other as Leanne's a local artist and with other people on how we can bring those initiatives into the inn in a way that profits both the artists and ourselves, but also brings awareness to the community about different projects going on. Leanne, you want to add to that a little?
So what we intend for New Plymouth eventually is to be a very art-centric town, and that includes artist residencies that will be made possible by housing the artists at the New Plymouth Inn, and also including satellite gallery spaces. Abaco Alchemy is my gallery space that is here that is opening the end of this month. And along with that and the Albert Lowe Museum and Captain Roland Roberts' house, which is also a historic, what they call a conch house architecture that is being restored. So what we are planning is walking art tours. Each one of those sites has GoFundMes. The town of New Plymouth also has a GoFundMe. There's a lot of crowdfunding that's been involved. But specific to the New Plymouth Inn, what we all see happening is satellite art experiences in New Plymouth that are centered around the New Plymouth Inn and that work hand in hand with the artists in making, you know, restoration projects that are art centric possible by the funds that are raised. So look out for that. Those things are definitely happening. My current installation that is here, Abaco Abacus, that is also going to be a fundraising initiative with myself and Matt Matlick, who is a second homeowner in Green Turtle Key. And we are putting that, that is going to go live within the next couple of days. And that's also an interesting art initiative. But things like this, we've been waiting. There's been like that niche with people reaching out and asking how they can help. But it's been a lot of crowdfunding, a lot of, and a lot more initiatives to come that will be operate as satellite type galleries and walking art tours and artist residencies that are beneficial to both artists and the sites that where they'll be staged.
Thank you for that. I have another question about the word resilience in regards to time. Quickly, and the word quickly is very prominent in the definition, and one of the adjectives for resilience is elasticity, which I thought was really interesting. But since it's 2 years post-Dorian now, and this idea of being resilient has been surfacing, I think even just like 2 days after the hurricane left. What can you give insight to what this urge to now, because Dorian was a very unprecedented event, this urge to bounce back quickly means, and how feasible is that in this present time?
I think, and we've talked about this, Jody, I think that resiliency, the term got a very negative connotation just because of the use by certain powers, governmental powers in the Bahamas after the fact. And, you know, this title of family islanders or anyone, especially Grand Bahamians, because they've been through this time and time again, being in Hurricane Alley and experiencing this devastation every 5 years, a major hurricane. And I think resiliency became a cop-out that signified that you're on your own and you need to pull yourself up from your bootstraps, and just navigating this term. So the fact that this conference entitles resiliency, I think we've all had to wrap our minds around it and get past that and think of it in a positive light. So I like that you have spun it in the terms of elasticity, because you do have to be very cognizant of what is resiliency, and if it is self-imposed, then, you know, what is the positivity in a self-imposed resiliency if you're left stranded without no other help. So I think that that's an important thing in noting Abaco and its rebuild after the storm. What is positive resiliency, and what is, you know, a people that have been left to no other means but to do it themselves. And how do you navigate that, and how do you circumvent that from happening?
Yeah, Felicia, I see you nodding. Say anything?
Yeah, I mean, Andrew and I weren't here right after the storm, so we empathize with Leanne and everybody else that was, but this has been my home since I grew up. So just seeing the forced resilience of the people, as Leanne was saying, is important to know that some of it, there was no other choice for people. Like there was no help. So it's just a matter of what we had to do, what they had to do, and coming back and seeing our people come together, and whether that was forced or not, you know, we had to do what we had to do. And I mean, when I think of that word, I think of Leanne and my other family that was here after the storm, just pushing through, doing whatever could be done after Hurricane Dorian, or the storm as it's deemed nowadays on Abaco.
Yeah. So my follow-up question to that would be, what infrastructure can we put in place to assist with that elasticity? So I think a good example of that is the Roman numerals that were on the columns, because they knew that obviously the structure will fall down, but we could quickly put it back up if we have, you know, this marked with this and this aligned with that. With that in mind, and I'm not just talking about in the Bahamas, but if you think about if there's a proposal that you would have to you could put forth to CARICOM or another agency like that are talking about sustainability and climate change and different things like that. Yeah, what infrastructure would you propose that we collectively devise to help with that elasticity?
I believe that the first and foremost important is ensuring that building codes and that old structures that are being brought up to modern requirements to, you know, stop a lot of these unnecessary collapses of historical homes and other buildings that are, you know, have stood the test of time, but certain things can be done and to ensure that they're ready for these kinds of winds, ready for the flooding, ready for debris, whatever it may be. Setting up a system that can maybe go and especially for a lot of the older homes, having people go in and survey and bring it up to where it meets standard modern requirements would save, at least in the aspect of saving historical preservation of towns like Green Turtle and other, towns that have a lot of historical properties to it. That'd be a big game changer. Looking forward to not have to deal with another Dorian, where here in Green Turtle, more than half a dozen historical homes were torn down because they were seen as unfit for to live in.
Interestingly enough, though, those houses that had to be torn down that were hundreds of years old withstood Dorian, whereas almost all of the other houses on the Key got knocked down during the storm. So it's an interesting thing to compare.
Yeah, that's something that I was going to touch on as well, is that I feel like this should be something that is an architectural survey should be done. What structures, what are the architectural features of these structures that have made it through 2 superstorms, and how can we incorporate that into making it commonplace in our art. I think we phased out a lot of things that builders of the past kind of had it figured out, and they knew what worked in certain ways, like the pitch of a roof, how things were put together. And I think in the vein of modernization, we've moved away from that, but we've also lost things that were tried and true that they had figured out. And also, Jody, as far as sustainability in the vein of modernizing, I think in Green Turtle Key, we've been very lucky because we have a state-of-the-art school that has been funded by crowdfunding, by donations. And it is built to withstand a Category 5, but it's also going to double as our hurricane shelter here. But it's a test structure for what other shelters should be, I think, not only in the Bahamas, but in the Caribbean, because it has a self-contained water plant that literally will not go down, that will provide the entire town with water in the case of another storm like this. We'll have holding tanks. We aren't going to run the risk of being without water, how we were after Dorian, where there was absolutely no potable water source. And we will have a structure that can potentially house the entire town population in the case of another storm like that. And that's something that we definitely have to start looking into with the climate conference that has been going on, and both Barbadian Prime Minister Motley and our Prime Minister, Mr. Philip Davis, both of them spoke to the resiliency in Caribbean countries and how we, to quote Mr. Davis, Honorable Prime Minister Brave Davis, we cannot outrun carbon emissions. This is something that we are going to have to adapt. And how are we adapting? And the school here is and hurricane shelter is one of those such ways, because we are going to have to evolve. Knowing that the potential is that these storms are going to keep getting worse and more prevalent.
Yeah. That's a great point. I think that when we, and I'm constantly thinking about how we categorize art and culture, and often because we have like a Ministry of Works in the Bahamas, and we have a Ministry of Youth, Sports and Culture, architecture is not seen as an art form in a way. And we don't quite reference it often in these conversations. So thank you for referencing that. I guess I wanted to ask, because I think that there, and in all like respect, there's this kind of privilege of being able to have this platform as persons from Green Turtle Key, given that Marsh Harbor, Abaco was also devastated, and Grand Bahama as well. So I guess I would like to take an opportunity, if you can, and if you can't, I understand, to, if you can, bring a light to what has happened in Marsh Harbor, and how that preservation and that rebuilding looks like. And I know, Leanne, you have been in conversation with persons from Grand Bahama as well. Like, what can you talk about the sort of differences in the way in which it's being talked about, or the visibility, or just the collective push from the North to rebuild?
Yeah, this is something that we've also talked about. As well. If you aren't a model community, if you haven't bounced back, if you haven't had this this self-initiating resiliency, and you are like certain places in East End, Grand Bahama, and in Marsh Harbor, and you haven't quote unquote bounced back, and you aren't this exemplary community, and they are shying away from showing those kind of communities. How do we, as one of those exemplary communities, be the voice for other places that still need help, that haven't gotten the help? We are very, very lucky here that we had a second homeowner community that put us on the map and really pushed for us to get funding, and created this network for us to continue on. And it created the momentum. Everyone wants to get behind a community that has been positioned as the go-getter community, but we wouldn't have been able to do that without the assistance from the second homeowner community and our neighbors in Florida. And how do you then take that and bear the responsibility of also being the voice for your brothers in Abaco mainland and in East End, Grand Bahama? And I think that that's something that is also going to have to go forward in how we become our brothers' keepers in the Bahamas, because it's something that, you know, in the midst of trying to rebuild your own community, how do you also go ahead and still be your brother's keeper? And there was some of that happened as far as distribution centers here, and Andrew and Felicia were a part of that when they arrived, with us taking supplies that we were getting and actually creating a route to where we were actually disseminating out of Green Turtle Key Distribution Center to communities in the north, Cooperstown and Cedar Harbor, up to Crown Haven, because they were being overlooked. And how is that a way? How do we then create channels going forward to where that doesn't happen, and to where the relief efforts are distributed equally? And I think that that's something that the government here has to be
Held accountable for. Yeah.
held accountable for. Exactly. Because there's only so much, if you're in the midst of it as a community. And I think that we see that in hindsight, because we were trying to rebuild as well. But how do you ensure that the distribution is fair and equitable to all communities, and not just to the ones that are deemed beneficial to the Treasury or to a certain segment of the community here?
Yeah. So we have a question, and it'll be our last question before we wrap up. What funding is in place to address the structural changes of existing houses? So is there any funding available?
Unfortunately, Felicia, Andrew, and myself, this is another project that we were spearheading, is seeking out with Antiquities, which is an entity that exists here, to see what funding. Unfortunately, even though they are a government entity, there is no funding behind it. So we have been reaching out to private entities and also researching grants, but that is something that is not currently available in the Bahamas, which we would love to see made available. Another avenue that we have been exploring is petitioning to become a cultural heritage site, which would also open New Plymouth up to certain UNESCO grants and World Heritage grants. But that process is long and arduous, and as far as it being time sensitive, it's not something that we'll be able to tap into right now, but hopefully in the future.
Yeah, I think unfortunately a lot of these historic buildings were overlooked until Dorian, and they had to be ripped down. And in that moment, we all realized the importance of them. And as Leanne, Andrew, and I are here as, thrown in cultural workers or historians or whatever we are these days, we're seeing that there's not the funding for these things. I mean, we bought this historic inn that's almost 200 years old, and we're relying on ourselves and the generosity of people. The government, there's nothing in place for historic buildings. We can get put on a register to say we're historic, but it's kind of just a title. There's not any sort of funding for these historical buildings that show our culture and show that architect. There's nothing out there in the Bahamas right now through the government anyways.
I think it's really important to note that we are going to be the prototype community for solving these issues, and the inn is definitely, we're hopeful that it's going to be the prototype for figuring out certain gaps in what should be cultural preservation, the protocol that should be in place. And that is like Felicia just said, what are we today? That is kind of one of the hats that we're all wearing as well, is troubleshooting and figuring out what really needs to be in place for cultural preservation, because it has been overlooked for so long and there hasn't been that importance allotted to it governmentally or in any sector, as far as the building codes, as far as funding made available. So we're taking notes as we go.
Yeah, there was a point made by Amanda Colson. I don't think she'll mind me calling her name. But she said that there were budget cuts along in these cultural sectors in culture and antiquities that would be places that would provide the funding. So I guess it then reiterates and supports you guys' point that there is quite little care for the sustaining of these places. And I think that this then propels us into a larger conversation about what we deem as important and who, who the thing is important to, which then renders it important. So I would like to thank you both, you three, for your time. I really appreciate it, and thank you all for joining this panel discussion. You can find Leanne on Instagram, and I'm sure that you can follow Felicia and Andrew as well on Facebook and Instagram with New Plymouth Inn. And they would love to, hear from you all if you have any further suggestions on how they could assist with rebuilding, and any tips that you would have as well in regards to restoration projects. So I will sign off now. Thank you once again. Thank you, Mac, for having us. Oh, you're welcome.
So just a very, very big thank you there to Jody, Leanne, Felicia, and Andrew. I think, we were just getting into some incredibly important questions about the evolution of recovery from trauma and things like equity to access of relief materials, to government policy around cultural preservation and funding, and so many critical points that I think Mac is very interested in continuing the conversation about, has been investing in terms of training and connection to resources for many years, and would love to continue working with all of you on that. As you said, this really is an amazing model that could be shared around the region, because we're all going to need ongoing new knowledge, on the ground, practical information, and it's evolving very quickly in the world that we're living in. So thank you all. I was incredibly inspired by that. And it sort of brought us full circle as well to Mark Raymond's conversation that opened Mac about this idea of anticipating memory and thinking about it ahead of time, because we really do live in countries that have, not all of us, but many of us have been slow to catch up with the value of that cultural heritage. So thank you for that. This is our last formal session of the MAC 2021 conference. So a huge thank you to everybody who has contributed, our planning committee, our tech teams, our presenters, moderators, and our special social hosts. We are going to be going into a session very shortly at 3:45, and I'll say 2:45 Cayman and Jamaica time, because that's where I am, into another final social sip and mix. And we're going to be hearing some Junkanoo remixed music as well. So it's going to be a great way to end this session that has been inspired by the Bahamas before we head over to meet with you all next year. And we are going to ask our tech team to put a link in the chat again for feedback in a survey. Please take a few minutes to complete the survey about your experience at the conference. It will really help us to continue to grow MAC and ensure that the conference continues to grow next year as well, hopefully on site or maybe with a hybrid model from the Bahamas. So thank you very much, everybody. Again, thank you to our amazing panel and moderator. And we will see you shortly at the social sip and mix. There's the SurveyMonkey link in the chat right now, so we'll just keep it open for another few minutes. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.